What if the soldiers who bled in the jungles of Vietnam were never meant to survive? What if the leaders who sent them in already knew the cost, but chose to sacrifice them anyway, to protect secrets buried deeper than the tunnels of Suit? The Vietnam War is remembered as a conflict of brutal battles, shifting front lines, and unimaginable sacrifice. But beneath the chaos of firefights and ambushes, there lurked another war, a shadow war, hidden agendas, secret deals, and decisions made in smoke-filled rooms far away from the battlefield. Young men, barely 20 years old, walked into the rice paddies believing they were defending freedom. Yet, some of them were walking into death traps, not by accident, but by design. Why were certain units ordered to hold impossible positions? Why were rescue operations delayed until it was too late? Why did intelligence reports vanish, only to surface decades later with blacked-out pages? Tonight, we peel back the curtain. We follow the whispers of soldiers, the doubts of commanders, and the chilling question that still haunts history. Were American troops sacrificed, not for victory, but for something far more sinister? Stay with us. The truth is darker than you imagine. What if the jungles of Vietnam were not just battlefields, but theaters where unseen hands choreographed the bloodshed? What if every ambush, every lost patrol, every young soldier swallowed by the jungle was part of a script written thousands of miles away? The Vietnam War did not begin with the roar of helicopters over the paddies, nor with the thunder of artillery on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It began in silence, in strategy rooms where men in suits debated lives as though they were numbers on a chalkboard. In the early 1960s, American advisors arrived in Vietnam to assist the South Vietnamese government. The mission, at least as it was told to the public, was to stop the spread of communism. But as the war escalated, questions began to whisper through the ranks. Why were decisions on the ground so disconnected from reality? Why were troops being ordered into near-suicidal missions that made no tactical sense? Imagine a 19-year-old Marine, sweating beneath his helmet, gripping his rifle with trembling hands. He doesn't understand the politics. He doesn't know about the men in Washington who argue about domino theories and credibility gaps. All he knows is that he's been sent into a dense jungle with orders to hold a hill that offers no strategic advantage. The rain falls, the leeches cling, and somewhere in the darkness, the enemy waits. When the ambush comes, it is brutal. Hours later, survivors wonder, why were they sent there at all? In the grand narrative of Vietnam, some battles seemed destined to fail before the first shot was fired. There were reports of units sent without proper air support, or supplies that never arrived on time. Families back home were told their sons died heroically, but the soldiers who made it out whispered something different, that they were pawns in a larger game. And the game was not about winning the war, but about sustaining it. The deeper you dig, the more chilling the questions become. Could it be that certain units were deliberately sacrificed to maintain appearances? Could leaders have chosen to lose certain battles to protect hidden deals, or to avoid exposing intelligence operations? In the jungles of Vietnam, truth and lies often wore the same uniform. One of the most haunting examples was the Battle of Chi San. Thousands of Marines were ordered to hold an isolated base, surrounded by tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops. The siege lasted 77 days, turning into one of the bloodiest standoffs of the war. Officially, Chi San was defended for its strategic importance, but years later, some historians argued it was nothing more than a distraction, a way to divert enemy forces while American command prepared for other operations. If that's true, then the young men who died in the mud of Chi San were sacrificed, not for victory, but for theater. And yet, Chi San was not unique. Throughout the war, reports emerged of orders that made little tactical sense. Soldiers were told to clear villages that were already empty. Others were sent back into areas they had secured just weeks before, only to face relentless ambushes. Veterans would later recall how they felt trapped in a cycle fighting foreground, losing it, retaking it, and losing it again. A cruel merry-go-round of death. Why? Because in Washington, statistics mattered more than survival. Body counts were the measure of success, not actual progress. And so, commanders pressed forward, desperate to show results, even if it meant sending young men into impossible situations. But the mystery doesn't end with flawed strategy. There are whispers of darker motives. During the war, massive defense contracts were awarded to private companies. The longer the war dragged on, the more money flowed into industries that thrived on chaos: ammunition manufacturers, helicopter suppliers, construction firms building bases that would later be abandoned. Was it a coincidence that strategies often prolonged the conflict rather than ended it? Was it incompetence or design? Consider Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign over North Vietnam. For 3 long years, American planes dropped millions of tons of explosives. Yet strangely, key targets such as ports and supply lines from China were often left untouched. Pilots returned frustrated, asking why they were forbidden to strike locations that could cripple the enemy. Could it be that hidden diplomatic agendas, secret negotiations, or even fears of provoking larger powers dictated these choices? And if so, what did that mean for the soldiers on the ground, who fought and died while their leaders held back the full might of their arsenal? Eyewitness accounts add layers to this mystery. Veterans recall being ordered to march straight into known kill zones, their warnings ignored. Helicopter pilots speak of missions aborted at the last second, leaving stranded soldiers to fend for themselves. Intelligence officers tell of reports buried, intercepted communications that revealed enemy movements ignored until it was too late. Each story paints a chilling picture that lives were expendable when weighed against agendas unseen. The cost of these choices was not just measured in body bags, it was measured in the erosion of trust. Soldiers began to wonder, were their leaders protecting them or using them? Letters home, filled with questions and doubts, sometimes hinted at truths too dangerous to say outright. Families would later discover fragments in those letters, phrases that now read like warnings. We were sent out there with nothing. They knew we wouldn't make it back. It didn't feel like a mistake. The Vietnam War became a graveyard, not only for soldiers, but for certainty. Historians still argue, was it incompetence, corruption, or cold calculation? Did leaders truly sacrifice their own troops to maintain illusions, protect secrets, or profit from the machinery of war? Or was it simply the tragic outcome of a conflict, too complex to control? The answers may lie in declassified documents, in testimonies whispered decades later, in the haunted eyes of those who survived. But one thing is certain, for many who fought in Vietnam, the enemy was not just in the jungle, it was also in the orders they were told to follow. And so, the mystery lingers, gnawing at history's conscience. Were American troops truly sacrificed to protect hidden agendas? Or is that question itself the shadow of something even darker, something we may never fully uncover? The deeper we go, the more unsettling it becomes. Because every time we think we've reached the heart of the truth, another layer of deception appears. What if the real war was never in Vietnam's jungles at all, but in the polished corridors of power where illusions were carefully crafted? What if the blood of American troops was spilled, not to win battles, but to sustain a political story the world was never meant to question? In the early 1960s, American leaders spoke endlessly about the domino theory. The idea was simple, frightening, and persuasive. If Vietnam fell to communism, then all of Southeast Asia would collapse one by one, like dominoes tipping against each other. At least, that was the story told to the public. It was the justification for escalation, the explanation for sending advisors first, then Marines, and eventually 500,000 American troops. But behind closed doors, some in government already doubted the theory. Intelligence briefings suggested that Vietnam was not the first domino, but an isolated struggle rooted in its own colonial history. Yet these doubts were buried. To admit uncertainty would mean losing political ground, losing face, and perhaps losing billions in defense contracts. So the illusion had to be maintained. Imagine being a soldier in 1965, stepping off a transport plane in Da Nang. You are told you are defending freedom. You are told you are protecting your homeland from communism spreading across the Pacific. You are told you are the thin line between democracy and chaos. But in truth, you are defending a theory already fraying under the weight of contradictions. And so, every mission you undertake, every bullet fired, is not just part of a war, it is part of sustaining a narrative. A story your leaders cannot afford to abandon. The cost of that story was staggering. As troop levels swelled, the pressure to show progress became unbearable. Commanders were ordered to provide statistics, not victories. Body counts became the measure of success. Numbers on charts replaced the lives of flesh and blood men. Villages were bombed, not for strategy, but to inflate reports. Patrols were sent deeper into hostile areas, not for necessity, but for numbers. And when those patrols were cut to pieces, when helicopters returned with fewer soldiers than they carried out, the illusion continued. The story had to survive, even if the soldiers did not. One of the most haunting cases was the Ia Drang Valley in 1965. It was the first major battle between American forces and the North Vietnamese army. For 3 days, waves of soldiers clashed in brutal combat. Helicopters ferried troops into a deadly cauldron. The official reports declared victory. The enemy lost more men. The body count favored the Americans. Yet survivors told a different story. that they were overwhelmed, surrounded, and only barely escaped annihilation. The so-called victory came at a terrible price, with entire companies nearly wiped out. Still, the illusion of success was broadcast to the American people. This pattern repeated again and again. Victories declared when none existed. Statistics massaged to fit the story. Young soldiers realizing too late that their lives were expendable in a war where appearances mattered more than outcomes. Veterans would later remember how they were told to secure hills, only to abandon them days later. They began to whisper bitterly that they were fighting for the illusion of progress. But illusions demand sacrifice. And that sacrifice was human. The political machinery in Washington thrived on these sacrifices. Each death, each report, each mission sustained the appearance of control. Presidents and generals stood before cameras, assuring the public that the war was being won. But behind the curtain, private doubts grew louder. Secret memorandums revealed uncertainty. Yet the war machine kept grinding. Why? Because to pull back would mean admitting failure, and failure could shatter careers, topple governments, and unravel the entire Cold War narrative. So soldiers kept fighting, kept dying, trapped in a web of deception spun far above their heads. Some historians believe that the real hidden agenda of Vietnam was not about defending freedom at all. It was about credibility. America's leaders feared that if they withdrew, allies around the world would question American resolve. If one domino fell, not in Asia, but in global perception, then America's power would weaken everywhere. So the war had to continue, not to win, but to prove that America would not quit. But who bore the burden of that decision? Not the men in Washington. It was the 19-year-old in the rice paddy, the 22-year-old in the helicopter, the 25-year-old lieutenant leading his men into the jungle. They were the ones sacrificed for a credibility illusion that history now questions. Whispers of betrayal began to spread, even during the war itself. Soldiers rode home with letters filled with doubt. It doesn't make sense, some scribbled. We take ground only to leave it. We fight, but nothing changes. Back home, protests erupted. Students, mothers, and veterans demanded answers. Why was America still fighting a war that seemed unwinnable? The government responded with reassurances, but those reassurances were built on sand. Each protest grew louder. Each returning coffin weighed heavier, and the question became harder to silence. Was this war ever meant to be won? The illusion began to unravel in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive surprise attack across South Vietnam. American officials had promised that victory was near, that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. Yet suddenly, cities across the country erupted in chaos. Even the American embassy in Saigon was attacked. The credibility gap widened into a chasm. Soldiers who had been told they were winning now realized the truth. They had been sacrificed for lies. Tet was not just a military shock, it was a revelation. Proof that the story crafted in Washington was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Yet even after Tet C, the war dragged on for years. Why? Because agendas deeper than victory were at play. Defense industries, political reputations, global credibility all demanded that the war continue. And so it did. Mile after mile, battle after battle, sacrifice after sacrifice. The jungles devoured men, helicopters ferried more into the fire, and still the illusion lived. Soldiers continued to ask, were we fighting for freedom, or were we dying for a lie? Decades later, declassified documents would reveal shocking truths. Leaders had long known the war was unwinnable. Private discussions admitted doubts, even as public speeches promised victory. Lives were lost not because of military necessity, but because of political calculation. The domino theory was not just a flawed idea. It was a weapon, wielded to justify endless sacrifice, and the soldiers who fought under its shadow were its victims. Even now, the question lingers in the air, like jungle mist. Were these young men heroes of democracy, or martyrs of deception? Were they honored defenders of freedom, or were they pawns in a game that was never about them at all? The truth lies buried under decades of speeches, memos, and half-erased documents. But the faces of the fallen still whisper the question to us. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this. If soldiers can be sacrificed once for illusions, what prevents it from happening again? What if the cries for help echoing through the jungles were never meant to be answered? What if soldiers trapped under fire, clinging to life, were abandoned? Not because rescue was impossible, but because someone far above decided their sacrifice served a greater purpose. Throughout the Vietnam War, countless soldiers recall moments when help was agonizingly close, yet never came. Helicopters circled, orders stalled, Reinforcements delayed until the gunfire fell silent. Survivors returned home with haunted questions. Were these tragic mistakes of war, or deliberate choices made to protect secrets, strategies, or political optics? In the thick humidity of Vietnam, time was a cruel enemy. Minutes could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Units caught in ambushes radioed desperately for support. Sometimes, help arrived too late. Sometimes, it never arrived at all. For those who lived, the silence of command haunted them more than the bullets of the enemy. They began to wonder, were they expendable? One chilling example comes from the 1967 Battle of Ong Than. A battalion of American troops, under Colonel Terry Allen Jr., was ordered deep into enemy territory with little preparation. The North Vietnamese army lay in wait. The ambush was devastating. Entire companies were nearly wiped out. Survivors radioed desperately for reinforcements, but delays and confusion at higher levels left them stranded. When relief finally came, the jungle floor was already littered with the fallen. Families back home were told it was a tragic battle, but some officers later whispered that intelligence reports had already warned of heavy enemy presence. Why then were those men sent in with so little support? Stories like Ong Than repeated across the war. At times, helicopters were grounded, not by weather or enemy fire, but by orders. At times, airstrikes that could have saved pinned-down units were withheld. Official explanations spoke of logistical constraints, of miscommunications, but veterans remembered it differently. They remembered being told to hold out longer, to endure just a little more, even as casualties mounted. It was as if their suffering bought time for something else, something hidden from them. The theory of sacrifice for strategy began to grow among the troops. Perhaps certain units were left in harm's way, to lure the enemy into the open. Perhaps commanders delayed rescue to avoid revealing intelligence capabilities, such as intercepted communications or secret monitoring stations. In the shadow war of Vietnam, where the CIA ran covert operations alongside military campaigns, every decision was tangled with secrecy. If rescuing a unit risked exposing a hidden program, would leaders choose silence over salvation? Some veterans believe the answer is yes. The most infamous echoes of this silence come from Operation Lam Son, 719, in 1971. South Vietnamese forces, supported by American air power, launched an offensive into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the mission collapsed into disaster. Thousands were killed or captured as enemy forces surrounded them. American helicopters flew desperate evacuation missions, but orders restricted how many troops could be rescued at once. Images of men clinging to skids, falling into the jungle below, burned into memory. To this day, veterans of Lam Son 719 argued they were abandoned for political reasons. Leaders in Washington wanted to test Vietnamization, the policy of turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces even if it meant sacrificing men in the process. Even darker are the stories of missing men. Soldiers listed as mere. Families were told their sons were lost, perhaps killed in action. But some whispers claim they were left behind deliberately. To admit the truth that American soldiers were captured and never recovered would have been politically devastating. Were some men abandoned to preserve the appearance of control? The haunting possibility lingers, like smoke over the battlefield. The human cost of these silent orders cannot be measured in numbers alone. Veterans returned home, not only scarred by combat, but by betrayal. They carried the weight of knowing that when they called for help, their leaders did not always answer. They buried comrades with the bitter suspicion that their deaths had been preventable. For many, the silence of rescue was more unbearable than the roar of battle. The mystery deepens when we examine the Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971. These documents revealed that American leaders had long known the war was unwinnable, yet continued to escalate anyway. Buried within the pages are chilling admissions about battles fought for appearances. Operations continued for political cover. If leaders could sacrifice entire strategies for optics, why not individual soldiers? The papers left Americans reeling with the realization that their government had misled them. For veterans, it confirmed their darkest suspicions. Their sacrifices had served agendas beyond the battlefield. Imagine the family of a soldier listed as killed in action after a delayed rescue. They sit in their living room, reading the letter from the Department of Defense. The words speak of bravery, of sacrifice. But what the letter does not say is that their son radioed for help, and none came. What the letter does not say is that decisions made far away sealed his fate. These families became guardians of questions that could never be answered. Because the truth lay hidden behind official statements and classified files, the emotional weight of abandonment extended far beyond the war itself. For decades, Debates raged over whether America left prisoners of war behind. Some claimed evidence existed of men still alive in Southeast Asia long after the war ended. Governments denied it, citing lack of proof. But families clung to faint signals, whispered rumors, and the agonizing possibility that their loved ones were sacrificed not in battle, but in bureaucracy. The silence of command, the delays in rescue, the abandonment of the trapped all, raise a question more chilling than any firefight. Did leaders knowingly allow their own soldiers to die for reasons of secrecy, politics, or deception? Or were these simply the inevitable tragedies of a chaotic war? The line between conspiracy and incompetence blurs in Vietnam, and in that blur, suspicion thrives. As we listen to the voices of survivors, the truth becomes harder to dismiss. Soldiers remember the sound of their radios, static hissing as they pleaded for help. They remember waiting as minutes stretched into eternity. They remember hearing the whir of helicopters overhead, then watching them vanish into the distance. For them, abandonment was not theory, it was lived reality. The war may have ended decades ago, but the echoes of those unanswered calls still resonate. Each delayed rescue, each missing soldier, each classified page leaves us with the same haunting question. Were American troops truly sacrificed? Not by enemy bullets, but by silent orders from their own leaders. And if those orders were real, then perhaps the most terrifying enemy in Vietnam was not hidden in the jungle, but seated behind desks, thousands of miles away. What if the blood spilled in the jungles of Vietnam was not just the cost of war, but the currency of politics? What if young soldiers were not simply victims of battlefield chaos, but bargaining chips in secret deals, struck far away from the gunfire? The Vietnam War was more than battles in rice paddies and ambushes in jungles. It was also a war fought in shadows across negotiation tables, within smoky back rooms, and through whispered agreements, never meant to reach the light of day. While soldiers on the ground fought and died for inches of land, leaders in Washington and Hanoi maneuvered for power, prestige, and survival. And sometimes, the lives of those soldiers were the price paid to protect a political agenda. By the late 1960s, America was bleeding. The Tet Offensive had shattered the illusion of victory. Casualty numbers soared, public support plummeted. Yet instead of admitting the futility of the conflict, leaders doubled down. Why? Because to pull back would mean humiliation on the world stage. So instead, strategies shifted to sustaining the war long enough to negotiate from a position of strength. Soldiers were ordered into battles not to win, but to keep the war alive until diplomacy could craft a face-saving exit. Consider the Paris peace talks, which began in 1968. While negotiators debated across polished tables, soldiers were dying in muddy fields. To show strength at the talks, American leaders pushed for escalations on the battlefield. Entire operations were launched not because they promised strategic advantage, but because they promised leverage at the bargaining table. The soldiers sent into those operations were, in effect, political pawns. Their sacrifice bought nothing more than words spoken in distant rooms. Perhaps the most chilling whispers concerned the 1968 U.S. presidential election. Rumors and later evidence suggest that secret political maneuvering influenced the very course of the war. Some claimed that efforts to reach a peace settlement were deliberately sabotaged to gain advantage in the election. If true, then American soldiers continued to die, not for freedom or victory, but to serve the ambitions of men seeking power. The battlefield became entangled with ballots, and soldiers became casualties of politics rather than war. The shadow of betrayal loomed larger as stories emerged of restrictions placed on military operations for political optics. Targets that could cripple the enemy were declared off-limits, not for military reasons, but to avoid upsetting delicate diplomatic relations with China or the Soviet Union. Soldiers wondered, why were they forbidden from striking where it mattered most? Why were their sacrifices restrained by invisible hands? The suspicion grew that their lives were expendable so long as the political theater continued. Whispers also surrounded the role of American corporations in prolonging the conflict. Defense contractors reaped immense profits as the war stretched year after year. Helicopters, bombs, rifles, uniforms, all supplied by companies whose fortunes depended on the war's continuation. Could it be that decisions to prolong the war were influenced not only by politics, but by profit? If so, then soldiers were sacrificed not only for agendas of credibility, but for the balance sheets of corporations thriving on endless conflict. One cannot forget Operation Menu, the secret bombing of Cambodia. Conducted under the shroud of deception, it was hidden not only from the American public, but from Congress itself. Pilots were ordered to falsify reports, disguising their true missions. Why such secrecy? because revealing the operation would ignite political firestorms. Once again, soldiers became the instruments of agendas they could not see, flying missions shrouded in lies, risking their lives in operations denied by their own leaders. The war's final years reveal perhaps the darkest layer of all. As the United States sought to withdraw under the policy of Vietnamization, the goal was not to achieve victory but to shift the burden onto South Vietnamese forces, while America saved face. Yet, by that time, American soldiers continued to be deployed, continued to die. Was this not, in essence, a calculated sacrifice? Lives traded for political delay, for a more graceful retreat. The leaders could claim they had not abandoned South Vietnam abruptly, even as the cost was measured in blood. For soldiers in the field, the realization was devastating. They fought battles where the objectives shifted like shadows. 1 month, they were told to secure a region. The next, they were told to abandon it. They watched comrades fall for hills that were soon deserted, for valleys soon surrendered. It felt as though their sacrifices were not wasted by accident, but by design. The battlefield was never theirs to win. It was a stage upon which political agendas played out. Decades later, the release of classified documents, memoirs of officials, and testimony from insiders revealed the depth of these hidden deals. Agreements made in secrecy, delays orchestrated for elections, strategies shaped by profit and prestige paint a chilling picture. Soldiers were not merely victims of war. They were pawns in a game where survival, victory, and honor mattered less than maintaining illusions and agendas. Families of the fallen still wrestle with this truth. They ask not only why their sons died, but whether their deaths served anything beyond hidden politics. For them, the pain is doubled. First the loss, then the suspicion that the loss was needless, orchestrated, even exploited. Their grief lingers in questions with no clear answers. The greatest tragedy is not just the deaths themselves, but the erosion of trust. When soldiers begin to suspect that their leaders see them as expendable, the bond between nation and warrior shatters. Vietnam was not just a war lost in the jungles. It was a war that fractured the faith of an entire generation. Veterans returned, not only scarred by combat, but disillusioned, carrying the belief that their sacrifices were traded like coins in the dark markets of politics. And so we ask again, were American soldiers in Vietnam truly fighting for freedom, or were they sacrificed to sustain hidden deals, secret negotiations, and political ambitions? The evidence whispers from every corner of history, from the shadows of Paris to the jungles of Cambodia, from the floors of Congress to the factories of defense contractors. The story grows darker with every revelation. The haunting truth is this: in the war for agendas, soldiers were the currency, and the debts they paid can never be repaid. What if the greatest enemy American soldiers faced in Vietnam was not the Viet Cong in the tunnels, or the North Vietnamese army in the jungles, but the silence of their own leaders? What if the truth of their sacrifice remains buried, not beneath the soil of foreign battlefields, but beneath layers of secrecy, denial, and carefully constructed lies? The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Helicopters lifted off the roof of the American embassy. Desperate refugees clung to the last flights out, and the world watched as the once mighty U.S. military retreated in defeat. For the soldiers who fought and the families who mourned, the war had already ended long before that day. Yet the final images sealed the story of Vietnam, a war fought at staggering human cost, and a war that left behind more questions than answers. By the time Saigon fell, more than 58,000 American soldiers were dead. Hundreds of thousands more carried wounds, both visible and invisible. But the deeper wound lay in what they came to believe, that their lives had been sacrificed for reasons that had little to do with victory and everything to do with hidden agendas. From the domino theory that justified escalation, to the delayed rescues that left men to die, to the political maneuvering that prolonged the war, every thread we have followed leads to one chilling conclusion. The war was never just about Vietnam. It was about appearances, about power, about sustaining illusions at any cost. The haunting whispers of betrayal are echoed most clearly in the veterans themselves. They speak of being sent to secure hills, only to abandon them days later. Of being promised progress while watching comrades fall in endless cycles of blood and mud. They speak of intelligence ignored, of battles fought for numbers on charts, of rescue missions delayed until silence replaced the sound of gunfire. Their voices carried the weight of suspicion that they were not merely victims of a failed war, but pawns deliberately sacrificed for purposes they would never understand. The Pentagon Papers confirmed much of what soldiers had long suspected, that American leaders knew the war was unwinnable years before it ended. They knew, yet they chose to escalate anyway, To feed the machine of war with more soldiers, more battles, more sacrifice. Why? To protect political reputations, to maintain credibility in the Cold War, to keep defense industries thriving. The truth revealed in those documents was devastating. Lives had been gambled away, knowingly, for reasons that had nothing to do with victory on the battlefield. And yet, even the Pentagon Papers did not tell the full story. Many files remained classified, many reports remained blacked out, with only fragments visible through thick bars of censorship. What secrets still hide in those pages? What decisions, what deals, what betrayals remain buried under the label of national security? The families of the fallen may never know. The soldiers who returned may never receive the truth they deserve. And so, the mystery continues. Lingering like a shadow over history, the ghosts of Vietnam live not only in the jungles, but in the conscience of a nation. For every soldier who marched through the mud, for every family who received a folded flag, there is a question that cannot be silenced. Was it worth it? Or was the war itself a deception? An elaborate performance where the actors on stage were young men with rifles, and the directors behind the curtain cared little for their survival. The answers are elusive, but the patterns are undeniable. Time and again, soldiers were sent into impossible missions. Time and again, their sacrifices aligned not with strategy, but with politics. Time and again, the truth was hidden, delayed, denied. The war may have ended, but the questions remain as sharp as bayonets. Who truly commanded the sacrifice, and why? Even now, decades later, new revelations continue to surface. Declassified files hint at covert operations hidden beneath the war's surface. Testimonies from veterans grow bolder, their voices no longer constrained by fear or silence. Each revelation deepens the suspicion that Vietnam was not just a tragic war, but a deliberate stage where young lives were traded for agendas never meant to be spoken aloud. And so, the legacy of Vietnam is not only its death toll or its political fallout, its legacy is mistrust. A generation of soldiers returned home with doubts that never left them. A nation watched as its government's credibility crumbled. The war fractured faith, leaving scars not just on bodies, but on the very relationship between people and power. For many, Vietnam was not just the war America lost. It was the war that proved leaders could sacrifice their own and still call it honor. What, then, becomes of truth? Can it ever truly be revealed? Or will it remain buried in archives, sealed behind classified locks, whispered only in the memories of men who lived it? History may one day uncover the full extent of Vietnam's hidden agendas, or perhaps it will never fully emerge, leaving only shadows, doubts, and questions that refuse to die. But one thing remains undeniable: the soldiers themselves. Their courage was real, even if the causes they were told to fight for were false. Their sacrifices were genuine, even if the reasons were deceptive. They were the heroes of Vietnam, not because of what they achieved on the battlefield, but because they endured the impossible, and in doing so, exposed the truth that no illusion could hide forever. As we close this journey, we are left with one final thought. The jungles of Vietnam have long since fallen silent. The guns are gone, the bases abandoned, the flags lowered. Yet in that silence, the voices of the fallen still echo. They whisper not of victory, not of defeat, but of a question that will haunt us forever. Were they sacrificed by the enemy, or by their own leaders? And until that question is answered, the shadows of Vietnam will never truly fade.